Okay, folks, here's part 3 for the Module 7 lecture. We're going to turn now to disorders that affect kids. So a lot of the stuff we've been talking about can affect kids. Children can have anxiety disorders. Children can have depression. Children can show signs of schizophrenia, although it usually doesn't show up till late adolescence, more or less. So we're going to look at things that specifically show up in childhood and get diagnosed in childhood. In particular, we're going to look at autism and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, because we haven't talked about those yet. But just be aware, kids can have a lot of other diagnoses as well. So when they show up in childhood, sometimes we call them neurodevelopmental disorders. These are going to impact the ability to learn, the ability to emotionally regulate. This is a wide-ranging category, right? If you look in the DSM at all the different labels, you got stuttering, you got bedwetting, you got autism, ADHD. There's a lot of different things in there. So let's look at autism spectrum disorder. So it is a spectrum, which means that it ranges from very mild symptoms and signs to very extreme, and then, of course, everything in between. So something like 1 to 2% of kids show signs of autism spectrum, with males outnumbering females 5 to 1. This might be because girls show different symptoms, and we have been kind of blind to that. And there used to be a belief that girls can't be autistic. So, it would be, in girls, it would be diagnosed as something else. We're finally realizing that that's just not true. So this 5 to 1 ratio is probably shifting as we do a better job of dealing with girls with autism than we used to do, right? The picture here is showing a certain kind of play that's typical for many kids with autism, where there's like a ritualized component, putting things in order, sort of solitary play, which is often quite a solemn thing. It's serious business. And if you were to sit down next to this kid and take one of their little cars and start to play with them, they would not appreciate it. You're not welcome. This is solitary and it's serious. Okay? I'm going to show you a couple more pictures of this kind of play as we move along. So here's, why autism is in the news all the time. There is this big kerfuffle going on. It's been going on for a little while, where some people say the rates of autism are on the rise, and therefore something must be causing all these new cases, right? Like there's an epidemic underway. And that something, some people have argued, is vaccines. So let's just unpack that whole thing. So here's a graph showing the increase in cases. I mean, that's true. We have seen an increase in autism diagnoses since the early 1990s, which has led some people to say, oh my God, this is an epidemic, right? So is there an epidemic? Is that a real useful term to use here? And if so, what has caused this uptick, right? Here's another picture, by the way, of this kind of ritualized play. So here's what we know. Attempts to link vaccines with autism go back to one pretty bad study with looking at 12 kids back in the late 1990s. And that study reported a link between symptoms of autism and the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, particularly a kind of a version of the vaccine that contained thimerosal, which is a preservative. So some people said, aha, thimerosal is to blame. So after that one study got published, science did what science does, right? And attempts were made to replicate. Much bigger, much better studies were run to see if they too could find a link. And they have failed to find a link. So here we're looking at a study looking at 95,000 kids, right? Not 12. And there have been many like this, big, large-scale studies that have failed to find a connection. Right? So as far as the medical community and the scientific community are concerned, we have debunked this claim. And in fact, the journal that published that 12-kid study way back when, The Lancet, retracted the article and said they should have never published it. They found multiple flaws with the research, including indications of fraud. And so, they retracted the study. But by then, sort of the damage was done because the idea was out there, right? The horse had left the barn, and now there are parents out there who think that vaccinating your kids is harmful to them. The problem, of course, is that not vaccinating your kids is extremely dangerous. So we're seeing outbreaks of preventable disease here, including, measles in Florida, measles in other places now. We think part of the problem might be an illusory correlation where, kids receive the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine at 2 years old, right? And autism symptoms typically emerge and are diagnosed at around 2. So parents sort of draw this false conclusion where my kid just got vaccinated and now they're suddenly autistic. The one must have caused the other. When in fact, it's simply that they happen to show up at the same time. MMR vaccine at 2, and then autism symptoms beginning to be recognized and diagnosed around 2. So more evidence that this is not an epidemic. There have been changes in diagnostic practices that have cast a wider net. So what used to be called autism in the 1980s, that definition has expanded to include more kids now. It's not that there are more kids with autism than there used to be. It's that our definition of what autism is has expanded. And so that has led to larger numbers of kids being diagnosed. For example, what used to be called Asperger's disorder or Asperger's syndrome, that label is problematic for a bunch of reasons, including a link to the Nazis. So that label has gone away, and all the kids that used to get that diagnosis have been rolled into the autism label. Okay. Also, back in the 1990s, government legislation changed such that schools were starting to be given more money for every kid that was diagnosed with autism because it takes more resources to help kids with autism in school. And so there was suddenly like a vested interest in testing kids to see if they're autistic, because the more autistic kids the school has, the more money they get. And it's not to say the schools are being greedy, rather they just now had a reason to really drill down and investigate how many kids have autism. Okay, so there was a greater push to diagnose. So for all these reasons, we don't think that there's suddenly an epidemic. So it is a spectrum disorder, meaning that people will vary in terms of how many symptoms they have and how severe the symptoms are. People with high functioning autism have normal intelligence or higher, typically. Autism and intelligence are not kind of connected that way. But they might have issues with interpreting social cues, understanding things like sarcasm, emotionally and socially connecting to others, right? So that's Greta Thunberg there. She's a young woman with autism who, of course, has spearheaded a campaign starting when she was just a kid, addressing the issue of global warming and climate change, right? So, I mean, one thing to talk about now, we're shifting the conversation from the idea of disorder to neurodifference, right? So neurotypical and neuroatypical. And these differences that come with high functioning autism can also bring gifts, advantages, like the ability to focus for long periods on details of something, like sort of brutal honesty, like Greta Thunberg shows, right? She can sit down with world leaders and tear them a new one and not sort of balk at that. So there's some great sort of courage there. Excellent memory, unique, quirky sense of humor. These are all pluses, right? Now, at the severe end of the spectrum, I think we have greater justification in calling it a disorder because here, it looks really different. The child may seem to be unaware of other people. They may be nonverbal. They may make zero eye contact. They may shy away from physical contact. An early indicator at 12 months old is how often the baby looks at other people's faces, especially at the extreme end of the continuum here. Most babies love faces. Give them several things to look at. If one of them's a face, they'll pick the face. but the autistic child will show no such preference. And again, at the severe end, deficits in communication can be pretty profound. They may be nonverbal or barely verbal. And that becomes evident by about 14 months old when you are expecting the child to begin to use words, right? And again, at the severe end, you see this repetitive play, sort of obsessive compulsive type play, other kinds of repetitive restricted behaviors like body rocking, or hand flapping and other kinds of stimming. So stimming is when the person, does something like this or something like this, or, has some kind of body movement. Um, Usually it's a sign that they're happy or excited. And by the way, non-autistic people do this too, right? I stim when I'm happy. I do stuff with my hands when I'm excited and, demonstrating things. So it's not limited to people with autism. If you like sit and shake your leg a lot as you're sitting there or move your body around like that, that's stimming. At the severe end, self-injury is also common. Things like biting oneself or hitting your head on the floor, things like that. At the severe end, the child may also show a strong sensitivity to changes in the environment. They can be really sensitive to temperature or noise or bright lights. And that can lead to something called a meltdown, where the child kind of ceases to function and might just lie on the floor crying and yelling. Right? So where does it come from? Just like everything we've talked about, there's a nature and nurture component here. There's biological factors and there's environmental factors. So there is evidence for a genetic component here, right? So dozens of genetic loci, hundreds of alterations in the genetic sequence, expression, epigenetic transformation, and interactions with other physiological and environmental systems have been found to increase the likelihood of developing autism, right? So it's not a single gene for sure, but there are genes involved. Research also points to prenatal and or early childhood events that can interfere with brain development. So things like maternal stress, things like prenatal exposure to different levels of hormones. The brains of kids with autism grow unusually large during the first 2 years of life, and then it sort of slows down until age 5. Why? We don't know why. There may be different wiring in a number of brain areas, some associated with social thinking. So that might be, might goes away to explain difficulties with social interaction. So there's like a greater interconnectedness for kids with autism in their brain compared to other kids. So do we understand these terms? Autism spectrum disorder, the spurious, which means untrue, unfounded claims of an epidemic, and the untrue, unfounded claims of a link to vaccines. The role of genes here that we're exploring. Okay. Let's talk about ADHD now. So a disruptive impulse control disorder affecting something like 7% of kids in North America, with 3 times more boys than girls getting diagnosed. And again, that gender difference is probably because it looks different in girls. And traditionally, we've sort of gotten used to the way it looks in boys and have sort of underdiagnosed girls, right? So for girls with ADHD, it's often that they're kind of daydreaming quietly in the corner, kind of disconnecting from what's going on around them. That doesn't bother the teacher. It doesn't bother the other kids in the classroom. So it's going to be less likely to come to the attention of the teacher and therefore the parents, right? Whereas for boys, boys are more likely to show something like this behavior, right? Where there is disruption. And that comes to the attention of the teacher much more quickly and readily, right? So the symptoms, overactive, inattentive, impulsive, often talkative and friendly, but possibly having problems making and keeping friends because they're missing the more subtle social cues that other kids might pick up on. And they might make unintentional social mistakes that will kind of alienate them from other kids sometimes. So where does it come from? it has a genetic component. So there's a genetic piece to this. You don't get ADHD from watching too many cartoons or drinking too much sugary soda, right? There's a genetic piece. So genome-wide analyses identified 27 risk loci. That means locations on the chromosomes. 76 potential risk genes. Yeah. Okay. So it's not a disorder that's created by sugary food or something like that. And often there's reduced brain tissue in brain regions that control things like attention and motor behaviors and emotional regulation and motivation. So there's some evidence that the brains of people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder also develop more slowly than average. For example, some pediatricians talk about a 2-year delay in the brains of kids with ADHD. So the 12-year-old with ADHD in some ways is kind of like a 10-year-old, right? Now, people don't outgrow it, though. It's not like the kids with ADHD eventually catch up. Adults have ADHD, right? You don't stop having it. So it's something that is going to challenge people throughout their lives. People with ADHD struggle more in school and struggle more at work. So they have to come up with strategies to manage their issues, right? It's hard to determine the causes of ADHD because the behavioral profiles of kids can vary a lot. Okay, so do we understand these terms, ADHD, and the fact that it's got a strong genetic underpinning? Okay, I am going to pause here and we'll pick it up in the next one.